Okay, we're almost ready to start. They say it's not rocket science to do lectures at KTH, but sometimes it is. And we have a few viewers in Zoom also, and it's the viewers in Zoom we're trying to get online. Men nu byter vi till svenska. Jag är Christer Fugensang, Sveriges första astronaut.
Tack, Carl Mikael Bellman, som är vice föreståndare här på KTH Rymdcenter. Och jag är föreståndare för KTH Rymdcenter. Och jag och KTH Rymdcenter och hela KTH är väldigt glada och stolta att vi har Jessica Meir här. Och vi tackar också Rymdstyrelsen som ordnar en hel turné för Jessica i Sverige och då har föreslagit att hennes öppna seminarium i Stockholmstrakten, det blir här på KTH. Så jag träffade Jessica första gången våren 2014. Jessica började astronautträningen i Houston hos NASA. Hon var del av NASA-gruppen 21, jag var själv i grupp 16. Hon började på hösten 2013 och sen så råkade jag vara där på våren och det råkade vara någon slags avslutningsfest från nya astronautgruppen tillsammans med första den grupp som just hade blivit utbildad till flygledare, flight directors. Jag vet att Jessica förstår all svenska så att jag vet vad hon säger. Så när man går runt och pratar med folk och så plötsligt kommer det fram en flicka, jag vet inte på rätt sätt här, som pratar till mig på svenska liksom. Jag blir väldigt förvånad. Och sen väldigt glad när jag inser att wow, här har vi en ny svensk astronaut. Jag visste faktiskt inte, jag hade missat i flödet. Så Jessica, mamma är från Sverige, pappa från Israel. Hon har amerikanskt medborgarskap, hon har svenskt medborgarskap. Och när hon var då den första svenska kvinnan i rymden. Hon har också rekordet faktor 8 nästan, svenska rekord i tid spenderad i rymden. Och har också gjort 3 rymdpromenader. Och det var väldigt speciella rymdpromenader på det viset att det var den första som var enbart kvinnor som gjorde. Tillsammans med Kristina Kock. Och om ni vill veta mer om det där och varför det var så kan du fråga Jessica. För Jessica och Kristina höll ett föredrag på internationella rymdkonferensen som var i Dubai i oktober. De pratade bland annat om just det då. Så nu ska inte jag säga mer. Alltså, de kanske säger att Jessica, hennes utbildning är marinbiolog. Så biologi är hennes grej. Det visar att det finns väldigt många vägar in till att bli astronaut och komma upp i rymden. Men nu kommer Jessica prata så länge hon vill. Vilket jag tror kanske är ungefär 45 minuter om sin rymderfarenheter såklart. Sen blir det frågor. Ni som är på Zoom, ni kan skriva frågor i chatten. Kollar vi det. Och kommer inte bli möjlighet till liksom individuella fotografering, selfies. Det är så många här. Men däremot så några gruppfoton. Om det är liksom vissa grupper. Jag tror astronomisk ungdom är en grupp och andra så här. Så har Jessica lovat att vara med på det. Så därmed så... Ordet är ditt, the word is yours.
Okej. Tack så mycket. Tack så mycket Christer. Det är jättetrevligt att vara här. Men jag ska fortsätta på engelska för att det är lättare för mig. Och jag vet att din engelska är bättre än min svenska. Så. So I'm going to start the presentation by just showing you a video, which you've had a little bit of a preview of here already. And this video sort of encapsulates all of the highlights of what it's like to do a mission on the space station, starting with a launch, going through all of our main objectives on the space station, and then coming back home. And then I'll get into a little bit of a presentation as well. So this starts... Okay. Okay, let me go back. Okay, so this is starting in Kazakhstan since I launched to the International Space Station on a Russian rocket and space capsule from Kazakhstan. So that's my commander, Oleg Skripochka, an experienced cosmonaut. And this was also an historic flight because we had the first astronaut from the United Arab Emirates, their very first astronaut. So basically the equivalent of Christer. So you all know how important that is. The different stages of the rocket being expended as they've utilized their propellant. And that picture was actually taken by my colleague Christina Cook from the space station. So that was what it looked like when our rocket and capsule were coming toward them. And this was our view.
I confirm the contact.
Astronaut Jessica Meir.
You can see I was pretty excited to be there. And I was smiling that big for pretty much the entire 7 months.
Coming in through the hatch and seeing all these familiar faces feels like home already. It's going to be an amazing 6 months.
The best thing about being in space, of course, is just experiencing weightlessness 24 hours a day. It makes everything more fun when you can just spin around in a ball or shoot yourself down a module. This is showing some of the food preparation. You know, most of the meals we eat are just dehydrated like this here, or we just warm things up in our food warmer. But I actually received some cheese on one of the visiting vehicles, so I made sure to make a little charcuterie board. But you had to be a little bit more clever and actually get things to stick on your board in space. Even drinking water, of course, is a lot more fun in space. Exercise is a very important part of our day. We exercise for a block about 2 hours per day on the weightlifting machine, which you saw there, can configure into over 20 different exercises, the treadmill, and then also the cycle ergometer, a stationary bike. You know, without that, we would have a significant loss of our bone density and muscle mass. Even brushing your teeth is more fun when you're floating around. We were up there for several holidays, Halloween, and then several anniversaries for Apollo missions, so we wanted to commemorate those.
Merry Christmas.
As you can see, astronauts have many skills, including musical skills. We try anyway. But celebrating the holidays and, of course, just taking some time out like you would on the Earth is really important for us as well. But the real reason we're up there is, of course, to conduct scientific experiments. So we are doing scientific experiments ranging from combustion science, which you're seeing here, even flames burn differently in space. We do various physiology and medical experiments. We do a lot of cell biology, protein crystal growth, radiation experiments. Here you can see we're loading this airlock in the Japanese module, and we're going to be launching some small satellites. We grew lettuce during our mission. This is Mizuna lettuce, a sort of mustardy green, and it was really nice to have something green and growing that we were interacting with during the mission, and we got to have a fresh salad at the end of that experiment, so that was quite a reward. This is the life sciences glove box, so we're doing lots of different types of cell culture here, bone cells, we did some muscle cells, we do some rodent research in there, and this was a comprehensive physiological study that we did. That's our -80 freezer, so that's how we keep our samples cold before we bring them home. We did a lot of spacewalks during my mission, and Christer mentioned I was fortunate enough to have done 3 of them with Christina Cook. We also did some spacewalks that Luca and Drew did to fix the alphamagnetic spectrometer. So Christer can probably talk a lot more intelligently about that, the wonders of that device. But this is some footage of my first spacewalk.
Great EVA.
Drew, thank you so much. Thank you, Drew. Thank you so much.
And this was a series of spacewalks to upgrade the batteries on the space station, basically to give these new lithium-ion batteries. That was Italian astronaut Luca Parmitano. He was our commander. He was driving the robotic arm. Christina was on the end of the arm, and that's me translating out to our work site. And spacewalks are really a highlight, I think, for pretty much every astronaut. You know, it's a totally different feeling than even being in the space station when you're out there in your little mini self-contained spacecraft, you know, carrying everything on your back that you need to keep you alive. And the views are even a little bit different through that thin visor than they are through looking out the space station windows. So in order to resupply the space station, we have several different cargo vehicles that come up periodically to bring us food, new experiments, our clothing, everything that we need to live and work up there successfully. And those come to close proximity to the space station, and then we use the robotic arm to grow and capture those vehicles and then bring them in. That was a SpaceX Dragon. This is a Northrop Grumman Cygnus, and that's a Japanese HTV vehicle. So we had several different cargo missions come. We had some fresh fruits and vegetables that the Japanese delivered, so that was quite a treat. And at the end, we actually filled these vehicles full of our trash, and they burn up in the atmosphere, with the exception of that SpaceX Dragon. That one does splash down, so we can return samples or hardware, anything that we need. Invariably, if an astronaut has free time, you're most likely to find them in the cupola or in one of the other windows, just enjoying the views. And it really never gets old. It's just so breathtaking having that vantage point of our planet. All the different shapes and colors and textures, it really does look incredibly different and really like an artistic expression. And sometimes we're doing science as well, so we fly regularly over the same points, like for example the southern Patagonia ice fields, where we can take pictures, send them to the scientists, and help them monitor the retreat of the glaciers. That's the coast of Israel, coming over the Middle East. Those are flashes of lightning and all the city lights at night. That's the Nile River in Cairo. You can see all the population is really concentrated along the water source. Those are squid fishing boats, those green lanterns, squid fishing boats off of Thailand. And of course, the northern and southern lights are incredibly beautiful from space. Being Swedes, you probably all see them regularly, but I still have never seen them from Earth, so I've only seen them from space. Unfortunately, those 205 days went far too quickly for me. I would have much rather spent at least a year up there or maybe more. I wasn't ready to go home. We were particularly busy, so I think that was part of it. You know, we didn't have enough free time to just spend looking out the window and doing other things. But I was also coming home to a completely different planet. When I launched in September of 2019, of course, there was no known COVID-19. And we watched all of that from the space station and then returned in April of 2020 when things were really different on this planet. That's coming through the atmosphere, so that's actually the view through my window as you're literally burning up in the atmosphere, but luckily protected by the very robust heat shield. And then you touch down in Kazakhstan. The Russian search and rescue forces were there very quickly to extract us. This landing was a little bit more complicated than usual because of all the international air restrictions given the timing in 2020. But within 24 hours, we were already back in Houston. Some of us a little bit more wobbly than others. Okay, so I'm going to switch over to a presentation. And hopefully that kind of showed you the overall mission architecture and kind of a little bit of what it feels like to be up there on the International Space Station. And now I'll tell you a little bit more about my journey in getting there, because everybody's is quite different. And I think that's one of the really exciting things about the astronaut office these days. You know, when we started the astronaut program, all of the astronauts were pretty much the same. They were all white male military test pilots. And at the time, that made sense. They were testing these vehicles. We didn't even know what would happen to the human body in space. We didn't even know if these spacecrafts would function correctly and work. But now we are up there with the objective of completing science. It's a different mission. We have long duration missions. And so now our astronaut office is very much more diverse, which makes sense. You know, there are so many studies even here on Earth that show us how much more successful and how much happier employees are when you have a diverse workforce. So we have astronauts from all different backgrounds. There are a few of us life scientists. We're still probably the minority. Majority, I would say, still have engineering degrees, but we have physicists like Krister, we have chemists, we have other life scientists, we have medical doctors. So there's really a diverse workforce. Really, any STEM field can lead to a career in space. So this will just show you a little bit about my particular journey. And this is a vantage point. If you look up in the right, if you're familiar at all with the northeast of the United States, you have the very familiar shape of Cape Cod up here. And this is where I grew up, in a very small town in Caribou, Maine. And my parents, as Krista mentioned, my parents were actually married here in Sweden, and my oldest 2 sisters were born here, but then they immigrated to the US. So I was born up here in Caribou, Maine. And from the time that I was 5 years old, I started saying I wanted to be an astronaut. So as you can see, a very good Swedish mother had me on skis by the time I was 2. She actually brought those skis with her, those old wooden skis with her from Sweden when they moved. And also, right next to Caribou, Maine, is a town called New Sweden, where we actually had midsummer festivities every year and even some folk costumes here. So had a little bit of a Swedish influence in our lives from the time, even though I wasn't actually born here. In 1999, that's when I had my first adventures in microgravity. So having wanted to be an astronaut from that time when I was 5, I involved myself in any kind of space-related activity that I could. But biology was my favorite subject. So I was always studying that and kind of doing both things in parallel. When I was an undergraduate, I had a chance to combine both of those passions for the first time, and we designed an experiment to fly aboard what's called the Vomit Comet, an airplane at NASA that flies in a parabola shape. So basically, you're on the top of the parabola, the pilot shuts off the engine, you're in free fall, so you are experiencing microgravity for about 30 to 35 seconds, and they do a series of those. And we can use that as a test bed for microgravity research or to test certain pieces of hardware. So this was the first time that I did an experiment, and we actually we designed, as you can see in the glove boxes there on the right, we designed this experiment to compare conventional suturing. So we were using pig's feet, which a lot of medical students will use to practice suturing. We were comparing conventional suturing with using what was then a new tissue adhesive called Dermabond. Basically, it's like a medical super glue. It's very, very common and utilized everywhere now. But at the time, it was relatively new, and we thought it would be very useful for space. Suturing in space is a lot more difficult, especially for a bunch of non-physicians. So we thought it could be a quite useful application. So that was in 1999 when I was just finishing my undergraduate studies in biology. And that was, I would say, one of these first big transitions of my journey in reaching this job now, in turning from a student scientist to a science coordinator. After this, I did actually go pursue a master's at the International Space University, which was another extraordinary opportunity because I didn't quite know, I knew I wanted to go get an advanced degree, but at the time I was thinking about medical school or maybe doing a PhD. I couldn't quite decide. I found out about this International Space University, a year-long program in Strasbourg, France, and I thought, what a great opportunity. You know, it's a year living in Europe, in Central Europe, and I know it's about space, which I love, and then I can figure out what to do. Coming from that, I actually ended up going to NASA and getting a job, which was part of an internship that was part of my master's program at the Space University, led to a job working as a scientist at the Johnson Space Center, where I work now. So I was there from 2000 to 2003, and I know Krista recognizes Pedro Duque here, Spanish astronaut, and I'm training him here how to use the ultrasound on board the International Space Station. So of course I still had the desire to be an astronaut, but at the time I was there coordinating life science experiments, so helping write the procedures, being a liaison between the principal investigator, wherever they were in the world, and getting that through the NASA process, and then even training the astronauts how to do the experiment on board. We were talking about this earlier today, this period was really the beginning of building and constructing the entire space station. So there was very little time to do science on board. So it's really nice for me now at this phase, having flown on the space station about 20 years later, to see how much science and utilization we're doing now, which of course was always the main objective of the space station. So after 2003, after being there for 3 years, I had a lot of incredible opportunities, from training astronauts to living and working with them underwater in one of the analogs that we used called NEMO, the NASA Extreme Environment Mission Operations. And this is a really great platform because, you know, if you think about it, what do we do in order to prepare for space? How do we train astronauts? How do we test hardware, get things ready when we can't replicate all of the characteristics of space? So what we do is identify environments that have some characteristics in common. Maybe you need a life support system to go outside. You're living in a small, confined space with a few other people, and you can test these types of equipment. You can also train the astronauts in things like what we call expeditionary skills, basically how to play nicely with others. And that's something that's very important to the astronaut office these days. You know, we want to make sure that we're picking not only a top scientist or a top pilot, but people that are good team players and can work together, because when you're living together for 6 or 7 months or more on the space station, you really need to have that good cohesive team dynamic, not just a bunch of individuals. So I was fortunate enough to participate in one of those missions back then. This was it was the 4th NEMO mission, and we had a lot of different objectives. My main objective was to evaluate this use as an analog for the life sciences department to see if it would be a good analog for our experiments as well. So I was down there with 2 astronauts, Scott Kelly and Rex Walheim, flight director Paul Hill, and then 2 habitat technicians. So this was a really exciting adventure for me, especially at that phase of my life. But at the time, I had these incredible opportunities in those 3 years working at NASA. But as I mentioned, I'd always intended on going back to school. And I really enjoyed coordinating all of this other science that was done on other people. But I wanted to start doing my own experiments. So I started getting curious about what I could do and came across this field of study, diving physiology on animals, that really intrigued me. It kind of combined all of these things that I loved, this exploration, working outside, spending time in nature. You know, I'm sure I got that from my Swedish mom, just growing up, always being immersed and having a good, healthy respect for nature. And so I came across these researchers that were studying the diving physiology of animals like emperor penguins in the Antarctic and elephant seals in Northern California. And there are these extraordinary animals. An emperor penguin can hold its breath for 30 minutes. So imagine holding your breath now for the rest of the time that I talked. I don't recommend it. You know, we have nowhere near that capacity. But these animals have these extraordinary capabilities, and I wanted to really understand more about what it is in their underlying physiology that allows them to do that. So we actually went to the Antarctic 4 times for this research, and I got to go a 5th time as well to test out some dive gear. But these animals, as I've mentioned, I think they became quite famous with March of the Penguins, and for all these other behaviors, we know these extreme behaviors and how they incubate their eggs during these extreme Antarctic winters. But we were most interested in their diving physiology. As I mentioned, how can they hold their breath for 30 minutes? They're air-breathing, breath-hold divers, just like us. And they're not down there resting. They're swimming around actively and foraging, but they have a completely different response than we would have for exercise. And so those are the kind of things that we were looking at. We would put these small backpack recorders on them, and we would actually do surgeries where we were inserting EKG electrodes so that we could measure their heart rate during the dive. We also inserted PO2 electrodes. We could actually measure the partial pressure of oxygen in their blood vessels while they were diving, and then correlate it to what they were doing during the dive and try to understand all of the dynamics of their cardiovascular and respiratory systems and how their physiology could explain that incredible diving capacity. I was also very lucky to dive down there. It's really, if you're a scuba diver, there's no better place to dive than in the Antarctic. That is where all of the life is. You know, you're on the surface and you get used to this environment that's completely white, austere, devoid of any color, and then suddenly you plunge below the water and that's where you find all of the life. You have giant purple sponges, big red sea stars, big orange pycnogonids or sea spiders. This gigantism is one of the adaptations to dealing with the cold water given the surface area to volume ratio. And then of course you might have penguins or seals swimming around you as well. So quite an amazing place to dive. We also worked with this species, the northern elephant seal. So if you thought 30 minutes was impressive, this animal can hold its breath for 2 hours. And again, it's a mammal just like us. So how can you explain this extraordinary capability? So we are doing the same kind of experiments on these animals, putting recorders on their backs and measuring their diving capabilities and their physiology, the heart rates, the oxygen levels, and that kind of thing. From that, I decided that constituted my PhD work at the Scripps Institution of Oceanography. And then I thought, well, there's a whole nother world of animals that have equally as impressive behaviors and physiologies because they live or fly at high altitudes. So this is a bar-headed goose, and this is the species of goose that migrates twice a year over the tallest mountains on the planet. So again, this extraordinary behavior. And flying is the costliest form of vertebrate locomotion. So it takes more oxygen to fly than for any other animal to move around. So how do you explain that when this animal is flying over the Himalayas, where the oxygen level is only a half to a third the amount that we would have here at sea level? So same kind of thing. We wanted to study their physiology and try to understand some of those reasons. So this one was probably the most difficult thing I ever did, because what we decided we needed to do was to fly these birds in a very controlled environment in a wind tunnel so that we could put these different recorders on them. In order to do that, we took advantage of the imprinting instinct, which is very strong, particularly in waterfowl. So the first thing that they see when they hatch out of the egg, they think is their parent. So these are my baby goslings. We got bar-headed geese from a waterfowl park in the US, and so they're genetically the same as bar-headed geese in the wild. And these geese truly thought that I was mother. So I became a modern Mother Day goose, a modern mother goose. And they would follow me around, and it was really an incredible experience, especially for a woman in her 30s, to have these 12 goslings following me around everywhere I went. They grow quite quickly, and within a few months they already have their fully formed wings. Now the goal, as I mentioned, was to fly them in the wind tunnel, but unfortunately the wind tunnel at the university was broken when they were ready to fly. So we had to be a little bit more creative because we wanted to make sure that we could develop their flight capacity. So no data was collected in this phase of the experiment, but it was a lot of fun. We started out on a bicycle, and I would have the birds next to me. Within a day or two, the bicycle was way too slow for them, so we switched over to this little scooter, and I would go up and down the road with the birds flying next to me. And they would be flying so close to me that their wings would sometimes be brushing my shoulder. So it's really an amazing feeling to have that connection and be so close to an animal in flight like that. But in the end, we were successful at getting in the wind tunnel, and you can see that here. This video shows my undergraduate student doing all the hard work, as probably some of you are familiar with in here. And I'm kind of standing at the front of the tunnel encouraging the bird to fly. The bird's wearing a mask so that we can collect its expired air and analyze the oxygen and CO2 production so we can understand the metabolic rate. We also have another tube going in the mask delivering nitrogen, so we're lowering the overall oxygen that they're breathing in and simulating that high altitude. It's not hypobaric at high altitude because we're not changing the pressure in the wind tunnel, but we are making them hypoxic or reducing the amount of oxygen that they're breathing in. So this video, this bird is flying, maintaining its flight at 10.5% oxygen. So half that which we have here in this room, and that would be equivalent to an altitude of about 5,500 meters. We were also able to bring them down to 7% oxygen, which would be higher than the summit of Everest. So we did various, you can see the bird is wearing a backpack here, kind of like the diving animals were. So we're measuring heart rate at the same time. We're measuring oxygen level to really fully understand this cardiovascular and respiratory response. So that brings us to, I think, which is the last transition, or at least for now, when I completed all of these scientific studies. You know, I had gone from coordinating other people's science, then I decided to do my own, and I was doing these experiments on other animals, and then I became an astronaut where I became the subject. So to me, it was really making that circle complete, perhaps paying my dues for all of the science that I'd asked other people to do or asked the animal subjects to do, and then come to 2019 and 2020, and I am the animal up there in the extreme environment, being poked and prodded in the name of science. Doing a blood draw here. This was an experiment, a Japanese experiment, that was looking at cerebral, it was called cerebral autoregulation, so it was looking at blood flow to the brain. So various different physiological measurements being made here, my blood saturation, my heart rate. This was a little Doppler probe that was measuring that blood flow to the brain. As you can see, we have a lot of instruments going on. So if you go back toward this ultrasound, the picture from when I was training Pedro Duque how to use the ultrasound, and then 17 years later, I was using an ultrasound, actually a different one, an improved version, but just showing that last phase of my transition all the way through. So as we said, the primary objective of the space station is really scientific experiments. And so this is just an example of some of the numbers. I participated in almost 160 experiments. My colleague, Drew Morgan, who is an Army physician, he did a few more than me, but he had 2 months longer in space, so that's the reason why. In this photo, you can see we're getting set up for some rodent experiments. We had some really interesting experiments that we were doing with mice, and Drew and I really were quite passionate about doing these. You know, of course, having done animal surgeries in my previous career, we felt like finally we had something that was taking our backgrounds into account instead of the more heavily dominated engineering world of our colleagues. And Drew, being a physician, also had that kind of experience. So we really enjoyed doing those experiments. And I'm happy to talk a lot more about some of those particular experiments. I have some backup slides if we want to pull out a few examples like I did in a talk earlier today to get a little bit more in depth in any experiments. But in general, for the kind of resources that you might be interested in, there's an app that I would definitely recommend called the Space Station Research Explorer. This app you can search by discipline, you can search by experiment, you can search by mission period. So if you want to find out more on the physics side about the alpha magnetic spectrometer that I mentioned, you can go here and get a lot of data about the experiments and further resources. There's an app, there's also a website, so these are all available by nasa.gov, but if you just look in the App Store for Space Station Research Explorer, you can find that one. And some other research and web resources as well that we have at NASA. You can follow my social media, which I try to post about the science as well, or my training, whatever's happening at the time. Then there are these other accounts specifically for ISS research and for the National Lab as well. And there are some resources there for benefits of our research to show you some examples of those real benefits. But I think that's one of the really important things to remember. You know, sometimes people think, okay, this is cool, space research is helping you, keep people in space, explore further. But really it's about a lot more than that. And as we say at NASA, it's off the Earth, for the Earth. And there really are so many direct benefits of everything that we do to directly help life back here on Earth. It's not just about enabling future space exploration. There are a lot of different medical experiments, for example, which have directly led to treatments and to different pharmaceutical developments. In space, we can grow larger, more pure protein crystals. And this has allowed researchers to adapt specific target sites on those proteins for therapeutic protocols. There are drugs in clinical trials for Duchenne's muscular dystrophy. We've looked at Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, various other disease states. There are so many spin-off technologies in terms of the hardware development as well. There have been new discoveries such as cool flames from the combustion experiments. So there are so many different examples. And I think for you guys here, it's just such an important thing to remember when we invest this kind of money, this kind of support and resources in space. And I often use the Apollo program as an example. During the Apollo program, we had such an influx, so many resources that were poured into all of the STEM fields. And that's something that has been paying dividends for decades since, entirely outside of the space sector. We can expect that kind of impetus again with the Artemis program and returning to the moon. When you make these kind of investments in the space sector, there are always so many other benefits that come in so many different sectors, and including even just the simple one of inspiring people and the public to continue to study the science and technology fields. This is a photograph from Expedition 40. So I think this was a 2014 maybe. Let's see. 2014, and so that's a view of the Baltic Sea. So you should be able to make out some familiar landmarks there. And then I also wanted to point out, of course, it had been a while since a Swedish flag had been out on a spacewalk, and this is one of Christer's photos where you can clearly see that a Swede was indeed in space. And another one here that displays the flag quite visibly. Now, of course, I'm a NASA astronaut. I'm not an ESA astronaut, so I wasn't allowed to wear a Swedish flag on my spacesuit, but I made sure to bring one out with me anyway. So this is my cuff checklist that we have on our arm that actually does have quite an important purpose. We have, emergency procedures here if anything were to go wrong with our spacesuit, and also sometimes some cue cards specific to the duties that we're doing. If we were to lose communications or something, we have some information that we need there. But usually astronauts will put some pictures, some family members, or some things that are important to them. So I did make sure that a svenska flaggan was there once again, because I couldn't let Christer have all the glory. So we tried to, all of us bring things that are important to us to space and want to capture that, because for us it's certainly not just about us. This is not a mission for me. This is really a mission for everybody, and really for all of humanity. Especially for those people that helped us along the way, and just to represent, everything that's important to us. So one of the flight suits that we have, since I flew with the Russians, this was a Russian-designed spacesuit, and you can kind of do whatever you want with it. So I wanted to make sure that I had one flight suit that at least had a Swedish flag on it. And of course, I had to bring some reading material because, as I mentioned, my Swedish is, maybe more like the Pippi Longstrump level than anything else. So here I'm just brushing up on a bit of Swedish during the mission as well, and had a few other things as well that came with me. And all of these items are going to be given back to all of you, to the various organizations, so that you can enjoy them and share in them as well. We presented this flag earlier today. So I actually did a study abroad program when I was an undergrad and spent a semester at Stockholm's Universitet. So we had presented that flag back with them as well. So that's all I had to formally talk about. Again, here's a picture of Scandinavia taken at night. A really beautiful photograph. This was taken in 2015. Again, not by me. I might. Yeah, this is Scott's. I don't think I have a good picture of. I'm not even sure I tried that hard because I didn't think that we could get any. Because, given our orbit, we're only about 51 degrees, so we don't pass over the top of Scandinavia. It's difficult to get good pictures. But after realizing you can, so I have to look back at some of my pictures because I probably do have some. Unfortunately, we take hundreds per day when you're taking photographs, and then there's never enough time to actually go through them. So eventually I'll get to mine, and hopefully we'll have some good ones of this area as well. But this one that Scott took is really extraordinary. So with that, we can have plenty of time for questions. If you do want to talk about any particular experiments, we can do that as well. And I have some of those in backup slides, but probably people have some questions, so we could answer those.
Så, vifta med händerna så kommer den man och jag gå runt med de här.
Hi, I was just wondering what are your hopes for the future, going to the moon maybe and Mars? Is that something that you would like to travel to?
I would definitely love to go to the moon. That was actually, my mom tells me that I first started saying I wanted to be an astronaut when I was 5, but my first distinct memory was in the first grade when we were asked to draw a picture of what we wanted to be when we grew up. And I drew a picture of an astronaut standing on the surface of the moon, kind of that iconic Apollo image. So that was what I always had in my mind, and certainly fulfilled this dream of going to space, but that would be the real dream. And it is really interesting because this is realistic now. We are in what we're calling the Artemis generation, when we're finally building the spacecraft and the rocket. And if you've been following along at all, the Artemis 1 mission is on the launch pad right now. It's if all goes well, it'll be undergoing a test today, which will be the final test before it launches. If that goes well, then in a couple months it will launch, and that will be a test of the Orion spacecraft and the Space Launch System. It'll go all the way around the moon, even further than the Apollo missions, and it'll come back. It won't, there won't be any landing capability yet on this one. But we want to make sure that everything works correctly with the capsule and the rocket before we put humans on it. So if that goes well, then we would be assigning those crews shortly after it lands, and then the first mission with people on it will be about 2 years after that. And that will be, again, the same kind of trajectory, not landing yet on the moon, but going around it. And then the third mission, Artemis 3, is when we would have the first lander. So stay tuned. I would love to be involved, of course, and actually I am involved right now on the ground. So we all have different ground jobs when we come back from space, when we're not actively working and training for a mission. So my ground job right now is working to support the human landing system, which is the HLS program. That's the lander that SpaceX has the contract for right now for the first 2 landers. So I'm kind of a liaison between the astronaut office and SpaceX and following that program and hopefully helping it along. So we'll see what happens. We being realistic about it, it's a government program, so I can anticipate that there will be some delays. Right now, my classmates, our generation of astronauts, are pretty well poised to be on these missions, but we'll see what happens as things progress. And other than that, Mars, I think, eventually, really the goal of the Artemis program is to use the moon as a stepping stone. We'll have a sustainable presence there, but then to use that to go on to Mars. I don't think that will happen during my career as an astronaut. So, maybe some of you, maybe your children, I don't know. But it will be wonderful to see. I hope it happens in our lifetime. But my guess is I probably won't be involved. Going to the moon would certainly be enough for me.
Hi, firstly, thank you for the awesome presentation. So, when you're in the pub and you meet some new people, do you ever get funny reactions when you tell them you're an astronaut?
Yes, absolutely. You know, sometimes people don't believe you. We were at an event in New York City a few weeks ago, and we met somebody new, and my fiance said, "Oh, well, she's an astronaut," and you know, they carried on in conversation, and then he looked at me after, and this guy was like a famous actor producer, and a few minutes go by, and then he says, "Are you actually an astronaut? Really?" Like, no, we were just lying to you. But it is kind of interesting, you know, when I first got this job, and Krista can probably identify, you know, I actually was a little bit shy about saying it because I felt like it was kind of egotistical to bring it up. And so I would kind of avoid the question. I would say I was a scientist, or if they kept pressing, I would say, "Oh, I work at NASA." And if they kept pressing, then I would tell them. And now actually I'm a bit more open about it because I realized that, you know, it is really our duty to inspire and excite people about the mission and what we do, and in science and technology in general. And this is the one thing that's so pure. You know, when you talk about being an astronaut or going to space, everybody is just instantly has a smile and is so excited. And I think it captures this enthusiasm, this childhood-like enthusiasm that people have. And there are few things that are really that pure anymore that people get that excited about. So now I am a little bit more open about it. I try, you know, I don't want it to come across as egotistical, of course, but I think it just makes people happy. So if you can make someone smile, whether you're sitting in a pub or at an airport, you know, why wouldn't you do that? Especially if they actually do have a genuine curiosity in it. So, but yeah, there are a lot of interesting reactions.
We're going to take a couple of questions from Zoom, and then you'll get your chance. Krista can come up with a microphone. From Zoom, there was a question. Do you think there will be a day when there will be a purely female crew on the ISS?
So there has been a lot of media speculation about having an all-female crew, and you know, there's even speculation saying, "Oh, well, if we go to Mars, we should have an all-female crew." People make all of these arguments about why it would be better, but NASA doesn't make assignments or decisions like that for those kind of reasons, right? They assign crews for the right crews that are right for that mission. You know, even the first all-female spacewalk, it certainly was a milestone. It was really important that we realized after doing the spacewalk, mostly to pay tribute to the generations that came before us that worked so hard, breaking those glass ceilings in order to get us there, and to help inspire. But we didn't do that intentionally. We didn't do the first all-female spacewalk just to say, "Look, we did an all-female spacewalk." So I don't think that we would ever assign a mission that way. It could happen, but if it does, it would be because those are the right people for that mission, not because it's, you know, trying to be some kind of statement. So yeah, I don't know. We'll see what happens.
Hi. I just want to say it's so amazing that I can actually meet astronauts. And then you were talking about you made an experiment about nature and the animals breathing. Do you think that we will be able to use that in space? Or the other experiments you did on that?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, the research that I was doing wasn't necessarily directly applicable, but there are a lot of interesting parallels, I would say, with the type of research I did, and you know, maybe more things like this hypoxia research. If you compare when an animal experiences hypoxia, like these divers, they hold their breath, they experience very low levels of oxygen, sometimes they cut off blood flow to certain organs, and then they reperfuse this blood flow, and that actually causes a lot of damage to cells and tissues because of these oxygen-free radicals. So there are a lot of parallels that we can take from animals like this in order to solve some human medical problems, still things that are really big and looming. And some of those might benefit future space explorers as well. So if you think about a really long duration mission, and you know, people have speculated about what do you do with the astronauts, maybe you make them hibernate. You know, there are some comparisons there to hibernating animals and what you could use and how you could do that in order to prolong the longevity of the human, because you know, this gets a little bit more into the sci-fi realm, but if you're thinking about all of the logistical supplies that you would need for a mission, years and years and years, food and water water and all those supplies, it kind of becomes prohibitive unless you have a very sustainable system, or you can, put the astronauts to sleep for a while. So, there might be some things that we can learn from animal models and from studies like that, but yeah, I haven't applied any of my particular research to it yet, but we'll see. I always did kind of picture, maybe having one of my geese with me on the space station with a little helmet and see how they do, but I think it would be a little bit difficult for them to fly.
Is it a dream for you to use all your experiments you have done with the geese to make an effort in space?
It hasn't been something that's been realistically feasible yet, but maybe we'll see in the future.
So we have another question from Zoom. Maybe it's from one of the older listeners. They wonder, is there an age limit to being an astronaut?
There is no age limit. So, realistically, there kind of ends up being one because you have to still meet all of the medical criteria. So as we get older, you guys are all still fine, but, as we get older, we usually have more of these problems. So there is not a specific age limit, but, and usually astronauts are selected, I would say the average age of selection is around 35-ish, but we've selected astronauts as young as 28, and we've selected new astronauts as old as mid to late 40s even. So more than, I would say older than other fields in terms of starting a new job. But John Glenn was 77, I think, when he flew. He was the oldest person to fly, so he was still able to pass those medical tests required. Obviously, he was kind of a special case since he'd flown many years before as well. But it certainly is possible.
Hello. My question is, what kept you motivated to pursue your dream?
I think the main thing that kept me motivated was the fact that I had really discovered what I was really passionate about, and that's why I talked a lot about all the different journeys about becoming an astronaut. So for my classmates, for example, there were 8 of us that were selected in 2013. It was the first time that we had 4 women and 4 men, so we actually had 50-50 ratio. And we had me as a life scientist, we had an army physician, we had some military test pilots, we had an engineer, we had one guy who was a Navy pilot but also an astrophysicist. So you have this kind of diversity, but the thing that we all have in common is we all did what we loved. And even though our paths were so different, we all ended up in the same place because we had really followed that passion and worked really hard at it and taken some risks along the way and experienced failure along the way. I think all of those things are really the recipe for making your dreams come true. But I think because I was always doing what I loved, there was nothing, I didn't ever feel like I needed motivation. I had all the motivation that I was doing through all my biology research and then into this career now. And that was one thing that I felt incredibly fortunate for. I remember when I was young, people would say, "You're so lucky, you have this one dream and this one goal. I wish I had that. I don't know what I want to do." And I thought, I understood why they said that, but at the same time I thought, well, maybe, there's such a small chance of becoming an astronaut. It's never going to happen. And so will I ever find something else that really makes me happy and complete? So when I found this other career, working as a physiologist, working out in nature and really combining all these things I loved, I thought, wow, I'm so lucky because I know I'm never going to become an astronaut. So at least I found this other field that really fulfills me and completes me. So I think it was that, having these things that I was truly passionate about that just keeps you motivated. And there's always hard work along the way. There are always, life at NASA is far from perfect. There are a lot of things that are very frustrating about this job, just like any other job. But I can tell you, the moment I arrived in space, I knew that it was all worth it. It was just the first thing. It was like, I would do all of that again, and even all the hardships times 1,000, because this is totally worth it.
What do you think the important personality traits that NASA saw into you to select you as an astronaut?
So I think some of what I was actually just on my first astronaut selection board. So with this new class of astronauts that just started earlier this year, I was on the board that helped pick them. And what we really look for, of course, we talked about you need to have the STEM degree, of course, those basic qualifications. But once you have these highly qualified individuals that we're bringing in for interviews, all of them on paper are really perfect for the job, right? They could all do the job very well. But then what we're really looking for are all those other aspects. Like I mentioned, the teamwork. You know, we need to have people that are good at taking care of themselves. They're very proficient, but they're also good at contributing to the team. You know, there's somebody, I like to think about it as somebody you might want to go camping with. They can take care of their own gear. You know, they're not leaving a mess everywhere, but they can also, you know, cook dinner and pitch in and help somebody when they're struggling along the way. And those are the kind of individuals that we pick. And it used to be in the shuttle program, they would sometimes pick people just because they were a top scientist or a top pilot and maybe not the best person, but they seemed to be the right person for the job. Now that we have these long duration missions, the personality is a very big part of it, and we're not picking people solely based on their technical skills. They need to be a good team player as well. So the other thing is that you need to be quite diverse. You know, what we do, when I was on the space station, I wasn't a scientist, I was an operator. So I had to be able to not only do the scientific experiments, but also to do some spacewalks, to fix the toilet when it breaks, to change the light bulb. You know, we don't have plumbers and electricians. We all have to have a diverse skill set to do all these things. And so if you take an average, sometimes if you take a stereotypical scientist, you know, they might be spending all their time in the lab. They might not be that well-rounded, and that might not be the best person to be an astronaut. So we're really looking at that well-rounded factor. And I know for me, being a scientist, you know, when you're on the board and you see maybe an Army helicopter pilot come in, well, you know that they have this operational aptitude already. You know they have this technical ability because that's what their whole career was in the military. If you come in as a scientist, that's one of the things that you really have to demonstrate. So for me, I talked a lot about my time in the Antarctic, not emphasizing the science. You know, this interview is totally different than a regular job interview. Nobody cares what your publications, which journals your publications are in. They care that you spent time fixing a snowmobile or soldering a microprocessor. You know, that I always say the best thing I learned in grad school was how to solder. And so those kind of practical skills I had to demonstrate because they knew I was good at the science, but they didn't know that I was good at all these other things. You know, things like the technical scuba diving I did with the dry suit in the Antarctic, that has a lot of parallels to things that we do for spacewalks. So they knew that I'd operated in those kind of harsh conditions, relying on equipment. So I think for me, that was what helped me get the job.
Okay, coming back to your time in diving with the penguins, which looked great, by the way, but one of the Zoom listeners wondered, wasn't it dangerous to dive with the penguins?
Not the penguins themselves particularly, but it can be dangerous to dive in the Antarctic. You know, the water there is very cold. It's -2 Celsius all the time. There's no thermocline. And the most dangerous part of it is that it's an overhead ice environment. So you're diving through a hole in the ice. And, you know, if any of you scuba dive, you know, when anything ever goes wrong, what do? You come to the surface. But, you know, there you can't just go to the surface. There might be a seal blocking your hole, or you know, if you're lost, you need to find your hole. You can't just go up anywhere. So I would say that's, you know, but that's one of the things, you know, that we do, which has so many similarities to how we work at NASA. We have so many safety protocols, and we're very, very well trained. They won't even let you dive down there if you're not very well trained. So that kind of, I know that wasn't really a dangerous situation because of the training that we had. And the penguins themselves, I mean, they won't bother you. When you see them underwater, it's like watching a ballet. It's really incredible to see them darting around. And the wet-elle seals will come floating by too, but they're also not going to bother you. There was one time when I went into the dive hole and there had been a seal using that breathing hole. These wet-elle seals are very territorial about the holes, and they have actually special adaptations in their teeth so they can kind of chew through to the ice and create a diving hole. But if someone comes down with a big drill like we do and creates a diving hole, then they'll use that one as well. So we were waiting to dive one day, and the seal was up there breathing, and we're waiting for it. Finally, it went down, and usually then they'll leave. I came down, and if they see a diver, they'll usually swim away because they see the bubbles. But I came down, and the seal was still right there underneath the hole, and it startled me. You know, of course, this is like a huge seal. I mean, he was like hundreds of kilograms, and he was right next to me, and he just stayed there. And I thought, this is incredible, you know, as a biologist, to be this close to the animal. At the same time, if it you know, was just trying to play with me, it could have destroyed my life support equipment. And I was waiting there for my advisor to come down, and he came down, and then he couldn't believe that the seal was still there. So he had his camera And I'm basically like have my arm around the seal underwater posing for this picture, but unfortunately the flash didn't work. So I just have the memory.
I was wondering, once they had picked you, what was the training like becoming an astronaut, and how long did it take?
So once you're selected, you enter what's called the astronaut candidate training program, which is typically about 2 years, and you have to demonstrate proficiency in kind of 5 main areas. So one, you do some flight training. I actually had my private pilot's license before becoming an astronaut, but that's not a requirement. So anybody that doesn't have military aviation experience goes to Pensacola, to a Navy base in Florida, where you fly T-6s, which is a really cool airplane, to get you ready to fly the NASA T-38 jets that we fly. So the flight training is one. Then the spacesuit training is another big one. That's the most challenging thing that we do, really, both mentally and physically. Spacewalks are very challenging. So we train to do that in the neutral buoyancy lab, the large pool that we have in Houston. So you have to reach a certain proficiency level there. You have to reach a certain proficiency level in your Russian language training, since everybody on the space station has to speak both Russian and English. Then we do a lot of space station systems training, so learning about all the different systems, the electrical system, thermal control system, environmental life support system, to make sure that we understand how they work and how to do certain repairs. And then we also learn the other main area is flying the robotic arm, the Canadarm that's on the space station. So you have to get to a certain level of proficiency in all of those in order to graduate. And then sprinkled in through all of that training, you also have leadership training. So we do we'll do a water survival course, a land survival course. We did a Knowles backpacking trip, a 10-day backpacking trip together as a group to kind of emphasize some of those, what we call expeditionary skills. Working together well as a team. All of those different things are sprinkled in as well, but it's once you have demonstrated proficiency in all those main areas, then you graduate, and then you're no longer, they drop the candidate, so astronaut candidates are affectionately known as ASCANs, which isn't really the most glorious of titles. So once you finish that, you just become a real astronaut, and then you wait for your first mission assignment. And then when you're waiting, you're continuing proficiency and all those things. We don't want those skills to perish. But then that's when you're working the ground jobs, like I was explaining, me working with the landing system now, and then you wait for your mission assignment. When you're assigned a mission, it's usually 1.5 to 2 years before that, and then you're doing nothing but specific training for that mission.
So then what's your favorite position except astronaut at NASA?
Well, I think that would be a different answer for everybody. I think I would say the position that I respect the most probably at NASA are the flight directors. They are really, I've been so impressed by our flight directors, the knowledge that they have about everything about the space station. They're really the experts. We kind of dabble in everything because we have to be able to do so many different things as operators, but they're really the true experts and leaders in terms of the program. I would never want to be a flight director. Would you? So but it's interesting, there have been a couple crossovers. So there are some people that are interested in both. There is one astronaut that after he retired from being an astronaut, he became a flight director. So there are some people that are interested in both, but usually it's a different set of people that are interested in those two types of positions. But there are so many different jobs at NASA, it's hard to really answer that question, from the engineers that are working in the flight control positions to the other NASA centers of the people that are actually designing, spacecraft to go to other planets. JPL, I find fascinating, everything that they're doing. So I think there are a lot of answers to that.
So how did it physically feel when you came back to Earth? Was it difficult to walk or...?
It doesn't feel great. I was quite fortunate that I didn't have what we call space motion sickness going up or very badly coming down. When some people go up, some people do get quite sick for the first few days, maybe nausea, but maybe even some vomiting. But that doesn't happen to everybody. And I felt quite at home from the time that I got there. Coming back is worse. And I think it's interesting as a biologist because evolutionarily you would think that you should adapt quite quickly back to the environment you've evolved in versus in a completely new environment. But if you think about the physics involved and the direction of forces, it kind of makes sense. You come back and your body is not used to having any gravity, so you physically feel like you're being pushed down. and you're quite fatigued. You know, people are pretty tired when they first come back. When you very first come back, you're kind of like a drunken sailor because your inner ears, your vestibular system, really is dependent on gravity. And since it's been not used to having that for so many months, there's a lot of kind of reorganization there that takes time to readapt. Some people come back, and if they move their head, so what causes those neurovestibular problems is when you change planes because of the orientation of the semicircular canals in your vestibular system, which are, you know, very important for balance and orientation. And so some people, if they move their head, you know, there was one person, every time he moved his head for the first few days, he would vomit. So it's, yeah, I was really lucky I didn't experience anything like that, but you are quite tired in the beginning. Then, you know, after a few days, you're walking normally. Then but running takes a little bit longer to come back, I think because it's a more complex motor neuron connection. So it was really, I remember the first time I tried to run, and when you jump up, you feel normal, but then when you come down, you feel like an elephant. Like it's just really this like disconnect that your brain doesn't experience what your body is feeling. It's very strange. Then, you know, that takes a little bit longer, and people do have some cardiovascular changes where even though we're working out the whole time we're up there, running all the time, once you come back, it's difficult for people to run a mile just because, you know, you're not used to having all of this gravity working on your system. And then I think for most people, for these long duration missions, a lot of people have some back pain. I had some lingering lower back pain for a few months, but then that went away as well.
Yeah, a question from Zoom. What is your opinion on the commercialization of space?
So, you know, it's an interesting, you know, people are asking this question all the time, and my opinion is that it's a good thing. You know, more access to space for more people is a good thing. And, you know, right now, if you talk about space tourism and commercial flights, well, that's, you know, something that's still, it's not open to everybody. It's open to you if you have billions of dollars. But, you know, that's how every new industry starts. So hopefully, you know, it becomes more and more accessible, whether it's a suborbital flight or it's, you know, a real flight, an orbital flight to the space station. Now these are all actual options. I mean, people are doing these things. So, you know, if you're an astronaut working on that mission on the space station, of course we're going to help out. But, you know, it is different. It's a different environment when you have these public or tourist type missions on board. They have different objectives than you do. But it is, I think it's important for the future of space exploration. And I think the other, there's some misconceptions out there too, that it's kind of a contest between NASA and SpaceX. You know, we're not competing with SpaceX. SpaceX actually is only successful because they had a NASA contract that was originally, you know, responsible for them getting where they are. Now, of course, they're doing a lot of other things on their own, but, you know, they are working with us as a partner, under NASA contracts. So we're really working together, which is, I think, necessary for the future of space exploration because, you know, if you look back at the Apollo budget was 4% of GDP, and that was just the Apollo budget. Now the entire NASA budget, not just human spaceflight, but every element of NASA is 0.04% of the US GDP. So we're spending pennies compared to what we used to spend on the Apollo mission. So I don't think that any country alone can truly accomplish, you know, these types of grand missions anymore. So they need to be collaborative, they need to be international, like we're doing with the space station, and they need to involve commercial partners too, because as a government agency, we just can't do it anymore, I think, all on our own. I think that's going to be true going forward, that all of these missions are going to have to be collaborations with the commercial sector and internationally as well.
What was your favorite research project while you were up in space?
That's a tough one because there were so many, but I really liked the lettuce because it was so nice to have some fresh green things growing in that very sterile environment. But as a physiologist, of course, I really liked a lot of the physiology experiments that we did. There was a rodent experiment, and I mentioned that a little bit, that Drew and I really enjoyed doing. And there was one called Mighty Mice, which was really cool, and it basically was looking at the myostatin and activin pathways, which is very important in terms of muscle degradation in your body to kind of keep the whole cycle in check. So they flew 3 different types of mice. They flew a control group, then they flew a myostatin knockout, so they didn't have the myostatin gene, and then they had another group which we were giving injections to, a therapeutic agent that was basically inhibiting that myostatin pathway. So accomplishing the same thing as the knockout, but in a different way. And so that was a really drastic difference when, I can actually pull up one of these slides here because it's such a good example. Let's see. So we were actually in space measuring their bone density. That's what this machine is up here. We would anesthetize them and put them on these little sticky plates and then put them in this bone densitometer so we could measure their bone density while they're still alive in space. And this was called mighty mice because what happens with these myostatin knockouts, they have this really big muscle mass because like we said, it's important in muscle degradation. So if you don't have it, then your muscles grow even bigger. And this is the example. I mean, you can just see with the naked eye how big that mighty mouse is compared to the control group. And if you look at the morphology, look at that muscle mass. I mean, and also the bone density differences. So this is a great example of an experiment that has direct benefits towards the future space research because if we talk about going to Mars, the only reason we're coming back preserving our bone density and muscle mass now is that we have these incredible exercise machines that you saw in the video. But as you saw, those are all really big. And so when we think about the Orion capsule to go back to the moon and go to Mars, we're not going to have the luxury of big equipment like that. So we need to figure out either some really compact piece of machinery that we can do all the same things, or we need to have some kind of therapeutic agent that can help us preserve our bone density and muscle mass. And this is an example. These mice were up there. They were not exercising. They maintained their muscle mass. They maintained their bone density and quality. And so this could be of something that could benefit astronauts in the future. At the same time, these researchers that are responsible for this experiment, their main goal isn't space research. Their main goal is helping patients on the Earth in terms of osteoporosis for the bone side and any other muscle degradation diseases. So muscle atrophy, certain disease states which cause this breakdown of muscle tissue. And so that's what they've been studying these pathways for because they're trying to help patients on the ground. So this might be something that can, again, directly benefit patients on the ground as well. So it has those future applications off the Earth, but also for the Earth down here. And this experiment got a lot of press because of the whole mighty mouse. And it was a really great story. It was a husband and wife research team. They'd been working together for decades and finally got their experiment to fly. So that was one that we really enjoyed doing.
Hello. You went up there with the Soyuz rocket. So what can you tell us about your experience with working with the Russians? And I have a small correction. The NASA budget, when it was the biggest, wasn't 4% of GDP, but 4% of the federal budget, which was about 1/5 of GDP.
Sure, yeah. So working and flying with the Russians, it was wonderful, really. It was, to me, one of the highlights of the whole experience versus other than just being in space. It was that whole experience living and working in Russia, and I really, fell in love with Moscow, and it was an incredible experience. Flying on the Soyuz is totally different than flying on SpaceX Dragon or the shuttle, as Krister can tell you. I think it's a good example of the difference between American engineering and Russian engineering. The Soyuz has been flying for decades. It has this simple, robust design philosophy, and it is quite archaic compared to these new flying machines because it was developed so long ago. The SpaceX Dragon is much more complicated. It's much more electronic, right? It's really all computerized. And the space shuttle was the most complex flying space machine ever. But that kind of shows that kind of American, let's make something new and complicated and different versus the old kind of Soviet mentality of this robust vehicle. But, I was very happy to fly on a Soyuz because it's the most reliable rocket out there. SpaceX is doing a wonderful job, but they just don't have enough missions yet to show that same kind of reliability. So it was a really great experience. Obviously the situation politically is quite tense now and is a little bit, it's quite sad, from the state of things. So I don't know what will happen in the future. But for me, I can say that it really was a wonderful experience.
Okay, yes, so we will have 3 more questions. You, and then one from Zoom, and your last one. Then we have to stop the questions, because we have to take photos also and give Jessica time to prepare for a meeting with the Crown Princess.
Okay,
Cat's out of the bag.
Thank you very much for an inspiring presentation. I was wondering if going to space changed the way you look at the Earth and life here.
Yes, absolutely. And I think for me, for everybody it has a different effect, but a lot of astronauts come back as really avid environmentalists, even if they weren't before, because I can say, it really does change you. That was something that was important to me even before going to space, but I can say it resonated even more loudly after seeing the Earth with your own eyes from above. And it just is so extraordinary, the colors and the textures and the shapes, and you see this thin, tenuous band of an atmosphere, and you realize that that is what is protecting all of the life on this planet. And it is so not only beautiful, but utterly fragile, and that we really need to protect it. And that was something that was always important to me, but I think other people, I wish that everybody could see the Earth from that vantage point. And I think the other thing that really struck me was just seeing how interconnected everything was. You see these land masses and these connected oceans, and it's quite trite. Every astronaut says it, but you just realize there are none of these human-made borders that we've imposed upon ourselves, and you see that everyone shares the same home, that we really are truly one human. And we like to emphasize our differences, or we often emphasize our differences here on the ground, but it's really the similarities that are the most important. This is, we really are one human. So I think the other area is just really realizing how insignificant we are as people, as a planet, in the scope of the solar system and the universe. And when you look down at the planet and then you look in every other direction and you just see this void and blackness of space, it is really quite striking and gives you that perspective, which I think would be a very healthy perspective for a lot of the rest of the world citizens, and in particular our world leaders, to really be able to see and to try to appreciate that perspective.
We have one final question from Zoom, and to the Zoom audience, I'm sorry we couldn't handle all the questions, but the last one we take from Zoom is, what is it like to sleep without gravity?
I slept really well. People have different strategies, but what we do in our crew quarters on the space station are about the size of a phone booth. So it's not that much space, but you need less space in space because you don't have to lie down, and you can utilize the ceiling and the floor and everything around you. So we have these sleeping bags that we put on the wall of our crew quarters, so you're fixed to one wall. And then you kind of climb in your sleeping bag. Some people restrain their arms so they're not just floating around, because that might wake people up. Sometimes I had a little bit of shoulder pain in the beginning because, when we do when we're doing something for the camera, we actually physically have to hold our shoulders down like this because your resting state is like this. So all of those muscles have a different resting state, so sometimes it can be uncomfortable in the beginning. So I would actually put my arms up like this to sleep, which seems weird, but it actually made those muscles kind of relax more. Some people kind of put a belt around their arms and strap them down. Some people just completely free float. So I slept really well. I think most people do. Some people sleep much better in space because, a lot of people wake up with a sore knee or back or neck or something, and that doesn't really happen in space.
Final question.
Yeah, so thank you so much for a really inspiring presentation. I have a question about the spacesuit. So I saw in one of the clips there were like a small mirror on your right hand, and if you could talk about how that, or how you use that mirror, and if there's any other interesting function with the spacesuit that's worth mentioning.
Yeah, so we have those two wrist mirrors right here, and we do use those. Those do serve an important function. It's funny because sometimes you have to remind yourself to use it during your real spacewalk, because when we practice in the pool, we have these old versions that are so scratched you can hardly see in them. But right here on our spacesuit is what's called the DCM, the Display and Control Module. So everything for our life support system is really all controlled right there. And you can see a little display here, and then you have certain switches, and you have a temperature control valve there. So those things, because the spacesuit was not really the best ergonomically designed, interestingly, the hardest thing to do in the spacesuit, especially if you're not really tall, is to reach some of these really important switches, which you might have to to change something that would save your life. So you actually use the mirror mostly for that. So you can use the mirror to see, because you can't, there some of those, like the temperature control valve is like in this plane and it's a dial like this, so I can't see it. So if I take my mirror like this, then I can see how to change it. So that's mostly what we use the mirrors for, but you could use it to get a good view or reflection of anything, to fix your hair in the spacesuit or whatever you need to do. But yeah, mostly for that display and control module. I don't know, did you ever use yours for anything else?
No, I think that's fine. Thank you so much, and thank you everybody. And let's give Jessica another great round of applause. Super. On behalf of KTH and also Rymdresa, thank you so much for a super talk and all the interesting answers. Thank you for the questions. We're again very proud at KTH Space Center you had you here.
And I'll leave this for KTH as well, some patches and this signed photo. Each mission we design our own patches. So these are the two from my missions, the 61st and 62nd mission on the space station.
Thank you. So I know there's some